wanted to share with you kind of a part two here. As we get towards the second half of the first chapter, I wanted to pick up where I left off talking about time words, and where I mentioned those earlier. Um, we're going to talk about those down here in just a minute. Here we're going to talk about examples from the book that give this feeling of being lost or hopeless. And so I want to kind of establish that a little better too. Here's an excerpt from an essay that I had to write on this topic. And so I thought, since if I attached it, I didn't know if everybody would read it. I thought, let's go through it together really quickly. And so I'm going to read through it. Just follow along with me, and I want to point out some things that apply to the book. Second major consequence of losing an eternal standard in their lives. So if you don't believe in God, then you don't have a standard. You don't have something to say, this is right, this is wrong, here's what you do, here's what you don't do, here's the reason for this. If you don't have that eternal standard, it seems to be a subsequent loss of direction and purpose. So that's my topic sentence for this section, or my little thesis for this mini essay here. Gertrude Stein called the most significant post-World War I writers the lost generation because they felt emotionally, spiritually, ideologically homeless. The essence of this lost group is that they were disoriented. Without a magnetic north, meaning God, their existential compass did not work. Their characters often flounder without meaning, sometimes desperately search for significance in vain. One of the most famous post-World War I novels and one of the most revealing of the era's futility is The Great Gatsby. The motifs and themes of the era's feelings of emptiness, fleetingness, shiftiness, vanity, and longing pervade the novel through Fitzgerald's imagery and connotations. A resident stranger called the Owl-Eyed Man expresses shock in Gatsby's library has real books in it, saying repeatedly, "They're absolutely real." He's scandalized that something would be tangible. And so you have to see what's going on in the story. So I'm getting ready to give a list of all words in the story that are that make things feel temporary, intangible, things that are fleeting, just things that you can't quite get a hold of, things that are they're meant to connotate that things are temporary and meaningless. So there's a long list of words we're going to get to. To establish the themes, the author profusely uses words that connotate ephemeral vanity, just things you can't touch and things that don't matter. These are all words just from the first chapter that we're doing now. Abortive, short-winded, restless, chance, drifted, unrestful, forever seeking, wistfully, irrecoverable, supercilious, fractiousness, turbulence, fragile, breeze, balloons, rippling, fluttering, blown, flight, balancing. I'm not going to go through all the rest of these, but these are all words. Turbulence, sedative, cynical, abandon, flash, insincerity. All of these words are just from the first chapter. It's crazy how many of these words are used here. And so don't fool yourself into thinking that they're not there for a reason. You know, an author does not put this many words like this together in close proximity if he's not trying to establish something. So make sure you catch that. The fleeting, vapor-like actions of man are ubiquitous in Fitzgerald's Gatsby. Furthermore, as much as the actions seem pointless to the characters, there is still an underlying nebulous pressure or expectation. The phantom menace in the story is time. This is the antagonist. So if I ask you in a quiz, if I say, what is the main antagonist of the story? It's time. And the reason is because that is the pressure, that is the external force, that is, and every character is facing it. Time is the enemy of every single person in the story. And so it is undoubtedly the antagonist of the story. Proving itself as the sole judge and executive, time becomes the de facto God in Gatsby. From Gatsby's infamous line, "Can't repeat the past?" Why, of course you can. To him knocking off the clock from the mantle at the exact moment his 5 years' wait ends with meeting Daisy at Nick's cottage, time dominates the characters. Matthew Broccoli, renowned Fitzgerald scholar at the University of South Carolina, words it this way. Great Gatsby is time-haunted from in my younger and more vulnerable years to borne back ceaselessly into the past. This is the first line of the book. This is the last line of the book. So all the way from start to finish, it is time-haunted. At least 450 time words in the novel. Exclusive of character names, the second most frequent noun is time, with 87 references. House appears 95. Moments, 73 times. Days or days, 70. Minute or minutes, 49. Hours, 47. O'clock, 26. Year, 19. Past, 18. Against 5 appearances of future. That's kind of an issue too, which is fun. Months, 15. Weeks, 15. Twilight, 9. Clock, 6. Watch as a noun 5 times, and a timetable 3. The first striking image in the novel is the Buchanan's lawn jumping over sundials, another reference to time. Okay, stay with me please, I know it's boring. Each character finds himself or herself in a race with no goal. The major characters have all run from their Midwestern homes to the forward-thinking East with less accountability. They have shirked from the beliefs of the past, they have had their fun, now they stand lost and confused. Moreover, the lack of direction has given them deep despair. Daisy describes herself as cynical, saying that everything's terrible. I've been everywhere and seen everything and done everything. Her spiritless attempts to find joy have been exhausted. She is left with a distraction as her only respite from despair. She tells Nick that she hopes her daughter will be a beautiful little fool, because that's the best thing a girl can be in the world. She has an ignorance is bliss mentality because the reality of a purposeless life is crushing. Tom says he has terrible pessimism, and Jordan is described as having an absence of all desire. They are left thoroughly desperate and despondent. So, I'm trying to explain in this section what I meant in the story about talking about time references and also talking about the purposelessness they feel or the lack of direction. So with that said, let's pick up here in chapter 1. I skipped a little bit because, again, I know you're reading this, so you don't need me to read everything. We're going to skip down to this section starting right here because we're going to see some of these words. I want you to see them in context here. We walk through the high hallway into the bright rosy colored space. So there's our color, some color. Fragilely bound into the house by French windows. So we've got fragile. The windows were ajar and gleaming white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little way into the house. A breeze blew through the room. Blew curtains in at one end and out the other like pale flags, twisting them up toward the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as wind does on the sea. So you can kind of feel in this section that everything is meant to be light and airy and breezy, and what the author's going for here, the connotations are that things are temporary and wistful. Things are hard to get a hold of. They're hard to grasp. They're things that don't matter, so they're vain. All of those things are being captured with the connotations of these words here. This is important here. Don't miss this. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which 2 young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. So even the women were described as floating in light. The only stationary object was the couch, and it's because it was being sat on. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they had just been blown back, and after a short flight around the house. I must have stood for a few moments listening to the whip and snap of the curtains, and the groan of a picture on the wall. Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear windows, and the caught wind died out about the room, and the curtains and the rugs, and the 2 young women ballooned slowly to the floor. So when Tom comes in, all of the lightness, the airiness of the room collapses. And so that's the effect he has on them. The younger of the 2 was a stranger to me. She was extended full length at the end of the divan, completely motionless with her chin raised a little as if she were balancing something on it which was quite likely to fall. If she saw me out of the corner of her eyes, she gave no hint of it. Indeed, I was almost surprised into murmuring an apology for having disturbed her coming in. All right, one thing I want to talk about here with this section of the two ladies on the couch. We know that during the flapper era, or the roaring 20s, a lot of things shifted for women. Think about what's happened in 20 years. In 20 years, we went from, um, long dresses and very, conservatively dressed. And we went from that to having, you know, um, what's the word? Smaller outfits, things that showed a greater part of their bodies, and things that were just meant to draw attention to things that they didn't intend to draw attention to before. So in 20 years, we went from a shift in appearance, also a shift in values. For example, um, you know, um, oh, I can't remember her name right now. Baker, Jordan Baker. She's single and um, dates lots of different guys, and that's something that would not have happened 20 years before. That would have been very uncouth. And so, but she does that now with no shame at all. So she is just shamelessly doing whatever she wants, however she wants to do it. And she does it with complete dignity. And so she has her chin raised high here, like she's indignant. And he was almost surprised into murmuring an apology for having disturbed her by coming in. So she has supreme confidence. She has complete command of her space. And this is very different, and this has shifted for women in 20 years. If you think about what World War One did, it took a lot of men out of the home, sent them to Europe. So women had to work, and they were able to get jobs for themselves. And so something like um, women being more independent and more able to be independent kind of changed the dynamics of relationships. If women don't need a man for security and survival, then they don't have to play the games the men want them to play. They can do what they want. And so that's kind of what happened. We see a major shift here in the mentality of the women, and the way our culture, they affected the culture and the culture affected them, has shifted. And so that's worth mentioning here. The other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression. Then she laughed, an absurd, charming little laugh. And I laughed too and came forward into the room. I'm paralyzed with happiness, she says. She laughed again as if something very witty, she had said something very witty, and held my hand for a moment, looking up to my face, promising that there was no one in the world with so much she wanted to see. So she she likes to be the center of attention. She likes people to like her. She wants, and you'll see that more as we go here, but she very much cares about her image, and she wants things to be fun and light and easy. That's just a major part of her personality that we'll see. That was a way she had. She hinted a murmur that the surname of the balancing girl was Baker. I've heard that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean toward her, an irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. You'll notice it's a little weird the way he speaks about his cousin here, because he talks about her voice being like music, and he talks about her lips and all this stuff, and so there's a little bit, it feels a little sensual, but it doesn't have to be. And then at the same time, it could be. She is a second cousin once removed, and so that would not have been, it would not have been unacceptable. Second cousin once removed, it would not have been unacceptable for them to date at that point. And so it really could be that he was very interested in her, or it doesn't have to be either. If you'll remember, he describes Gatsby as being, there was something gorgeous about him. And that's not in his statement of attraction. That's just saying there was something very likable and attractive about him. So you don't want to jump to conclusions and think that he, you know, has homosexual tendencies. And here you don't want to assume that he's lusting for his cousin. That's not necessarily the case. So you don't need to go that way. Again, a sort of apology rose to my lips. Almost an exhibition of complete self-sufficiency draws from a stunned tribute from me. Complete self-sufficiency. She didn't need anything. I looked back at my cousin, who began to ask questions in her low, thrilling voice. So he just described his cousin's voice as thrilling. It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down as if its speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. Her face was sad and lovely with bright things in it, bright eyes and a bright, passionate mouth. But there was an excitement in her voice that men who had cared for her found difficult to forget. A singing compulsion, a whispered listen, a promise that she had done gay, exciting things just a while since, and that there were gay, exciting things hovering in the next hour. I told her how I had stopped off in Chicago for a day on the way east, and how a dozen people had sent their love through me. "Do they miss me?" she cried ecstatically. "Oh, the whole town is desolate. All the cars have the left rear wheel painted black as a mourning wreath, and there's a persistent wail all night long the North Shore. How gorgeous! Let's go back, Tom, tomorrow." And then she added irreverently, "You ought to see the baby." "Well, I'd like to. She's asleep. She's 2 years old. Haven't you seen her?" Here's another example I mentioned earlier on people being reckless or not taking responsibility. So she has very little to do with her daughter. She likes to show off her daughter, but she doesn't take care of her. She has people there to do that. And so just like the uncle had a servant to go fight the Civil War, Daisy has a servant to take care of her kid. And so it's not like she's working or there's any reason she can't take care of her kid, but she has someone else to do it for her. So basically, she shows her daughter off, but you don't see a lot of parenting going on from her. "Well, you ought to see her. She's..." Tom Buchanan, who had been hovering restlessly about the room, stopped and rested his hand on my shoulder. "What are you doing, Nick?" "I'm a bondman." "Who with?" I told him. "Never heard of him," he remarked decisively. And this annoyed me. "You will," I answered shortly. "You will if you stay in the East." "Oh, I'll stay in the East, don't you worry," glancing at Daisy and then back at me as if it were alert for something more. Um, okay, we're going to... All right, here's where we have um, the first mention of Gatsby out loud. And so he mentions that he lives next to Gatsby. And Daisy says, "Gatsby? What Gatsby?" So this is our first clue in the story that there's something going on between these two. So these two know each other from somewhere. And so this is a little bit of the, not foreshadowing necessarily, but this is the author telling you, or this is the first mention of what's going to be a major part of the story, his relationship with Gatsby and Daisy. Okay, Tom Buchanan compelled him to another room. Here's another. The slenderly, languidly, their hands set lightly on their hips, the two young women preceded us out onto the rosy-colored porch open toward the sunset, where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind. So listen to the wording here. Languidly, lightly on the hips, rosy-colored porch, sunset, 4 candles flickered, diminished wind. So all these things in this little short paragraph all have to do with something being light, flitting. So we're kind of jumping back and forth here. I know it's a little confusing because I was talking about gender stuff and then I was talking about, this stuff here with things being temporary and fleeting. It feels that way because that's what the author's doing. So the author's setting up a theme here and then he comes back to it 2 pages later. And so we are jumping around here a little, and I apologize that it's a little confusing. I'm going to skip through a lot of this stuff. Take that back. I'm going to stop here. "We ought to plan something," yawned Miss Baker, sitting down at the table as if she were getting into bed. "All right. What do we plan?" She turned to me helplessly. "What do people plan?" Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an an awed expression of her little finger. "Look, I heard it." We all looked. The knuckle was black and blue. "You did it, Tom. I know you didn't mean to, but you did do it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man. A great big hulking physical specimen of a man." "I hate the word hulking," Tom said, "even in kidding." "Hulking," Daisy said. Sometimes she and Miss Baker talked at once, unobtrusively, and with a bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter. So again, notice this is not the behavior of women from 1900, but something has majorly has shifted between 1900 and 1922 here. So in 22 years, or 20 years, we have gone from women behaving a certain way to now behaving this way. That they're talking over people, they're talking over each other, they're bantering inconsequentially, like their words aren't, purposeful. They are just nothing words, things of inconsequence. And that's different. This has changed. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me, making only a polite, pleasant effort to entertain or to be entertained. They knew the presently dinner would be over, and a little later the evening would too be over and casually put away. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from phase to phase towards its close in a continual disappointed anticipation, or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself. "You make me feel uncivilized, Daisy," I confessed. "Okay, I want to talk a little about this, and I'm almost done here." "Civilization's going to pieces," broke out Tom violently. "I've gotten the terrible pessimistic about things. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires by this man Goddard?" Okay, so this is a weird little inclusion here into the story. Like, why is Tom upset about this, Rise of the Colored People? Well, this is him being threatened by another people group, in this case African Americans, but it really doesn't matter who it is. What this is it expresses human nature for people who are in an established community to not want to be infringed upon. So if there's this outside subculture, the the temptation is to always push it away. So if you look at modern US, maybe there's this pressure to want to subdue, mass immigration, through every people group throughout time all over the planet. There is this tendency for people who are established to want to keep out people who might come in and overrun the place. And so that's why countries have borders. That's why they have, citizenship. That's why they have militaries and all sorts of things. And so this is no different here. But what he's referring to is feeling threatened, being white at the top of the food chain here as far as being wealthy in a country. And he was like, we need to keep these people down. We don't want them, the rise of the colored empires. And so that's kind of what's going on. I just wanted to explain that a little bit. Okay. I'm going to skip down here, or try to. Um, Again, I'm trusting you to read all this stuff. All right. Tom takes a phone call in here. Um, let's see. Okay. Tom takes a phone call, which we find out is from his mistress. And from here, he's going to want to go in town to see his mistress, and he's going to ask Nick to go with him. And so this is interesting because this is where we start to learn that our narrator, Nick, is very weak. So one of the things I'm going to ask you when we get farther in the book is tell me who is the good guy and who is the bad guy. And so we're not going to spoil the story too much and talk about how things go. But Tom is depicted as the bad guy, or as a bad guy in the story. So he's having an affair. But outside of that, he is an upstanding citizen. He does what he says he's going to do. He loves his wife. He, there isn't a lot of bad things about him. Compare that to some of the other characters that seem like the good people. And I don't want, like I said, I can't spoil too much, but let's take Nick, for example. Nick talks at the beginning of the book about how he's not judgmental and other people do all these things, but he doesn't. Well, he tries to make himself sound like the good guy, and he is the narrator of the story. That would be his temptation. But think about how weak he is. He's getting ready to go and visit the mistress of his cousin's husband. So he should be protecting his cousin. And instead, he goes along on the ride and has a party with the mistress. And so this is crazy. So he's weak. He won't stand up to Tom. He won't do anything to stop that. And then there are other things later in the story which we'll talk about too. Some of this, we can skip a lot of this for the sake of our discussion. I definitely want you to read it. All right. So here we have this conversation that happens between Nick and his cousin Daisy. "We don't know each other very well, Nick," she said. "Even if we are cousins, you didn't come to my wedding." "Well, I wasn't back from the war." "Well, that's true." "Well, I've had a very bad time, Nick, and I'm pretty cynical about everything." So keep in mind, she is beautiful, she's wealthy, she's well loved by everybody. She's got a trophy husband. She lives in a mansion. She has a very kept life. And so, how can she say she's very cynical and had a bad go of things? And so, that's kind of what we have to figure out here. Evidently, she had reason to be. I've waited, but she didn't say any more, and after a moment, I returned rather feebly to the subject of her daughter. "Well, I suppose she talks and eats and everything." "Oh, yes." She looked at me very absent. "Listen, Nick, let me tell you when I said that when she was born. Would you like to hear?" "Very much." "Well, I'll show you how I've gotten to feel about it, things. Well, she was less than an hour old, and Tom was God knows where. I woke up out of the ether and was utterly abandoned feeling, and asked the nurse right away if it was a boy or girl. She said it was a girl. So I turned my head away and I wept. "All right," I said. "I'm glad it's a girl." Or I said, "All right," I said. "I'm glad it's a girl. And I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, is a beautiful little fool." So we got to talk about that. Why is it important for a woman to be a beautiful little fool? And the short answer, and I want to spend a lot of time on it, but the short answer is because if you go along with the flow of what people expect of you and you just play the game, you have a life that is comfortable and easy, good. But if you want to be someone who thinks independently and goes against the crowd, you're going to have a rough go. And so what she's saying is the best thing that a girl can be is beautiful so that you're well taken care of, but a fool so you don't think too much. And that's a very, very short version here. You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow. She went on in a convinced way. Everybody thinks so, the most advanced people. And I know, I've been everywhere and I've seen everything and I've done everything. Her eyes flashed around in a defiant way, rather like Tom's, and she laughed with thrilling. "Sophisticated. God, I'm so sophisticated." And so this is her trying to laugh off what she's saying. She's very upset. She's saying, listen to what she's saying here. "I've been everywhere, I've seen everything, and I've done everything." So the problem is, and this is kind of what happens when you have a situation where the whole economy is very wealthy. Everybody's, in extreme comfort and lavishness. Well, what happens is when you get so used to everything being so easy and so good and whatever, it starts to not mean anything to you anymore. And you become numb. You become very numb to it, and you become kind of inoculated to fun. And in order to get your endorphins up, things have to get bigger and bigger. Well, she's to the point where she's completely numb. She's like, "I've already seen everything. I've already done everything. So there's nothing left to do." And so, which is a sad place to be, especially as young as she is. But she's saying that she's done everything she wanted to do. There was no purpose left. So this kind of feeds into this theme that I'm talking about, where um, she there's no purpose for her. She has no reason to do anything. She's already done everything. So when people don't have a purpose and they don't have reasons, then they lose heart, and it becomes a very sad place for people to be. And this is very, very sad, but it happens to us. I'm going to stop here again. So I wish we had made it a little farther. Maybe we'll do a part 3 here. If not, we can go on and we'll start with chapter 2. Thank you, guys.